These are 10 small English towns where the verified history turns out to be more disturbing than any ghost story. Villages where people were hanged on a child's testimony. A town that quarantined itself knowing most of its residents would die. A medieval city the North Sea swallowed whole. And a rectory whose haunting turned out to be the most elaborate paranormal fraud in English history. None of the darkness on this list requires you to believe in the supernatural. Plague pits, witch trials, black masses, sunken churches, and a skeleton found seated at a desk in a hidden room. Those are all documented. Every fact in this video comes from parish records, court transcripts, academic studies, or verified historical accounts, and nothing needed to be invented because the real stories are worse than anything anyone could make up. We're counting down from 10 to number 1, and once you hear the top spot, you'll understand why it wasn't a close call. If you've subscribed to the channel so the algorithm can recognize you, let's get started. Number 10. Bury Pomeroy, Devon, South Devon, near Totnes. A tiny village called Bury Pomeroy sits in rolling countryside with deep wooded valleys and a population of just a few hundred. Down in one of those valleys stands Bury Pomeroy Castle, a Grade 1 listed ruin managed by English Heritage, and it carries one of the most layered dark histories of any castle in the country. The Pomeroy family built the original castle, and in 1547 it passed to Edward Seymour, the first Duke of Somerset, brother of Jane Seymour, and Lord Protector to the young King Edward VI. Seymour himself lost his head for treason in 1552, which already sets a certain tone for the place. 2 ghost stories define the castle. The White Lady, said to be Lady Margaret Pomeroy, was allegedly imprisoned in the dungeon beneath St. Margaret's Tower by her jealous elder sister Eleanor after both fell in love with the same man. Eleanor starved her to death down there, and visitors still report phantom hands brushing against them on the stairwell alongside waves of extreme cold. And then there's the Blue Lady, whose story goes much darker. According to the legend, a daughter of a Norman Pomeroy lord was raped by her own father and bore his child, which was then killed. Her blue-cloaked ghost supposedly lures men toward dangerous sections of the ramparts and tries to shove them over the edge. Sir Walter Farquhar, an eminent physician who lived from 1738 to 1819, provided the first documented report of seeing her. Within the Seymour family, the Blue Lady functioned as a death omen. When a castle steward's wife fell ill, a doctor spotted the apparition. The steward insisted it meant death, and the wife died that night. A separate tale describes 2 Pomeroy brothers during a supposed siege, donning armor, blindfolding their horses, and spurring them over the ramparts rather than face capture. Historians point out that Bury Pomeroy never actually faced a siege, and the story likely migrated from St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. Lightning struck the castle in 1685, and by 1694 to 1701, the place stood abandoned. John Prince captured that decay in his 1701 book The Worthies of Devon, writing, "The apartments within were very splendid, 'tis now demolished, and all this glory lieth in the dust." The White Lady legend itself traces to an 1806 Gothic novel called The Castle of Bury Pomeroy, which means it's almost certainly fiction that hardened into folklore over 2 centuries. English Heritage treats the ghost stories as tourist attractions, not verified phenomena, but the atmosphere of the place gets under your skin regardless. Number 9. Bungay, Suffolk. Over in the Waveney Valley of East Suffolk, the market town of Bungay holds about 5,127 people and the distinction of being the only town in the UK that still appoints a town reeve rather than a mayor. Norman Castle, 17th century Buttercross, 11th century church, a pleasant English town by any measure, unless you happen to be sitting in St. Mary's Church on the 4th of August, 1577. A devastating thunderstorm hit that Sunday, and according to contemporary accounts, a massive black hellhound burst through the church doors while the congregation prayed. Reverend Abraham Fleming documented the event in a pamphlet titled A Stranger and Terrible Wonder, writing, "This black dog, or the divil in such a likeness, wrung the necks of them both at one instant clean backward. 2 worshippers died. After that, the creature reportedly covered 12 miles to Holy Trinity Church in Blythburgh, killed a man and a boy there, and brought the steeple crashing down. What keeps this story alive 4.5 centuries later is physical evidence you can actually go and touch. Scorch marks still scar the north door of Blythburgh Church, known locally as the Devil's Fingerprints. The name Blackshuck itself comes from Old English skucka, meaning devil or fiend. Lightning almost certainly struck the church during that storm, and the hellhound was likely a way for terrified survivors to explain the damage. Fleming operated as a London clergyman who probably assembled his account from exaggerated oral reports. A 7-foot, 200-pound dog skeleton unearthed near Leiston Abbey in 2013 briefly excited shuck enthusiasts before being identified as just a Great Dane. None of that stopped the story from colonizing every corner of the town's identity. Blackshuck appears on Bungay's coat of arms and the town weather vane. The local football club goes by the Black Dogs, and the rock band The Darkness named a track Blackshuck on their 2003 debut album. An annual Blackshuck festival has run since 2022. And here's a genuinely odd modern detail. When the 2021 UK census results came in, Bungay and the surrounding area had recorded the highest number of self-declared Satanists in the country. Number 8. Minster, Lovell, Oxfordshire. For anyone who appreciates a good real estate mystery, Minster, Lovell delivers. This Cotswolds village of about 1,409 people sits on the River Windrush in Oxfordshire, 6 miles east of Burford, centered on the atmospheric ruins of Minster Lovell Hall. William Lovell, 9th Baron Lovell and one of the richest men in England, built the Grand Courtyard Manor around 1431 to the 1440s. Today the ruins carry a Grade 1 listing. English Heritage manages the site, admission costs nothing, and the gates stay open 24 hours, which means you can walk in off the road at midnight and stand alone in those roofless halls. The story that earns this village a place on the list centers on Francis Lovell, 1st Viscount Lovell, born in 1454, childhood friend of King Richard III and one of the wealthiest barons in the realm. Richard's defeat at Bosworth on August 22, 1485 sent Francis fleeing, and he resurfaced to fight at the Battle of Stoke Field on June 16, 1487, the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. Witnesses spotted him fleeing on horseback, his mount struggling to cross a river, and after that moment, he vanished from history entirely. Until 1708, builders renovating the hall broke through into a secret underground vault, and what they found inside was a complete skeleton of a man seated at a table with a book, paper, pen, and ink laid out before him. A second skeleton lay at his feet, a dog. A cap sat in another part of the room, all much moldered and decayed. When fresh air reached the remains, they reportedly crumbled to dust before anyone could examine them properly. That underground room has never been located again. Sit with that image for a second. A man, possibly one of the most powerful barons in medieval England, sealed himself inside a hidden room with his dog, sat down at a desk to write something, and nobody ever came to let him out. English Heritage's own guidebook expresses skepticism, noting that Lovell spent little time at the estate and would have lacked a faithful servant there willing to hide and feed him for years. Other historians think he escaped to Scotland or Flanders entirely, but no one has identified who else that skeleton might have belonged to. A second legend attaches to the site as well. On her wedding day, a young lady Lovell supposedly hid inside an oak chest during a game of hide-and-seek. The lid snapped shut on a hidden spring, and she was discovered years later as a skeleton in her wedding dress. Thomas Haynes Bailey immortalized the tale in his poem The Mistletoe Bough in the 1830s, though folklorist Catherine Briggs tracked the same legend across at least 8 different English stately homes. Visitors to the ruins describe encountering a tall, thin, emaciated figure in a tattered cloak, hearing what sounds like a quill scratching across paper and feet shuffling on stone, and catching sight of a woman in white near the river. Number 7. Clophill, Bedfordshire. Clophill packs an extraordinary amount of genuine darkness into a very small space. A few hundred people live in this Bedfordshire village between Bedford and Luton, and its defining landmark is the ruined Old St. Mary's Church, roughly 700 years old, perched on top of Greensand Ridge. On or around the night of March 10, 1963, during a full moon in the depths of the Big Freeze winter, an unknown group descended on the ruined church. 6 days later, on March 16th, 2 children from Leagrave were found playing with a human skull jammed onto a piece of window frame stuck into the wall. Police traced the bones to Jenny Humberstone, who had died in 1770 at the age of 22, wife of an apothecary. Someone had arranged her remains on a makeshift altar alongside the carcass of a cockerel, consistent with a black mass or necromancy ritual, and multiple graves belonging to females showed signs of tampering. That was not the end of it. Jenny's grave suffered desecration at least 3 more times before April 2, 1963, then again on Midsummer Eve 1969, and again on Halloween 1975, when someone was reportedly shot at by people conducting a ceremony at the site. And this is where it gets stranger. Reverend Lewis Barker, rector from 1962 to 1969, kept Jenny Humberstone's bones locked in the boot of his car for 6 full years before fleeing Clophill on Halloween 1969. His explanation was that the witches were trying to kill him because he still possessed the bones. Layered underneath all of this, barely a mile outside Clophill at Deadman's Hill on the A6 in August 1961, James Hanratty shot and killed scientist Michael Gregston and raped and paralyzed Valerie Story, and Hanratty became one of the last people hanged in the UK when he was executed in 1962. Some context is worth noting. On May 8, 1963, students from Shuttleworth College turned up at the church dressed in white sheets, and the principal apologized for their high spirits, which suggests at least a portion of the incidents may have been pranks that the press amplified into something worse. A feature film called The Paranormal Diaries, Clophill premiered at London Fright Fest in 2013. A warden now maintains a regular presence at the site, and police run patrols every Halloween. Number 6. Dunwich, Suffolk, Britain's Atlantis. No ghost is required to make Dunwich one of the most haunting places in England. Today, the village sits on the Suffolk coast with a population somewhere between 84 and 183 people. What you'll find there is a beach, a pub called The Ship at Dunwich, a small museum, and the ruins of 2 medieval religious buildings. That's the full inventory. At its 13th century peak, between 5,000 and 10,000 people lived here, making Dunwich one of the 10 largest towns in England, comparable in area to the City of London. 18 churches, chapels, and monasteries served the population. The town operated a mint and a guild hall. 80 ships worked from its harbor, and its international trade extended all the way to Iceland. A bishopric had been established here around 629 to 631 AD, and then the sea ate it alive. A series of catastrophic storm surges on January 1, 1286, February 1287, December 1287, 1328, and 1347 chewed through the town piece by piece over centuries. One storm in 1347 alone swept approximately 400 houses into the water, along with 2 churches, shops, and windmills, and the Black Death arrived in 1348 to finish off the survivors. The last medieval church to go, All Saints, fell into the sea between 1904 and 1919, its tower finally collapsing in 1922 amid what was described as a waterfall of dead men's bones onto the beach below. Bones, skulls, pelvises exposed in the fallen earth. Local tradition holds that on still, moonless nights, drowned church bells can be heard tolling from beneath the waves. Whether or not you buy that, the physical evidence is staggering. An archaeological project running from 2008 to 2013 used sonar to confirm the ruins of St. Peter's and St. Nicholas's churches sitting in less than 10 meters of water, and the team mapped a submerged town site of approximately 1.8 square kilometers, now recognized as the world's largest medieval underwater town site. Professor David Sear of the University of Southampton, who led the survey, put it this way: "It is a sobering example of the relentless force of nature on our island coastline." Henry James visited and captured the desolation in English hours in 1905, writing, "Dunwich is not even the ghost of its dead self. One final absurdity. Dunwich ranked among England's most notorious rotten boroughs, sending 2 MPs to Parliament until 1832, despite having almost nobody left to represent." A 1589 map by Ralph Agus shows streets that simply stop where the cliff edge took over. The sole surviving gravestone belongs to Jacob Forster, who died March 12, 1796, at the age of 38, and it perches near the cliff edge right now, waiting its turn to fall. Number 5. Borley, Essex, the most haunted fraud in England. 111 people and 49 dwellings. That's Borley, a tiny parish in rural North Essex near the Suffolk border, and its entire claim to fame rests on a 23-room Gothic mansion called Borley Rectory, built in 1862, once labeled the most haunted house in England. The story of how that label was earned and then torn apart reads like one of the great cautionary tales in paranormal history. Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull built the rectory in 1862, and reports of unexplained footsteps started within a year. On July 28, 1900, 4 of Bull's daughters spotted what they believed was a nun's ghost at twilight, about 40 yards from the house. By 1928, a new rector's wife had discovered a young woman's skull in a paper bag stuffed inside a cupboard, and bells rang despite being completely disconnected. That's when Harry Price entered the picture. Price, a psychic researcher and expert conjurer, arrived at the rectory on June 12, 1929, and declared it England's most haunted house almost immediately. Under the next rector, Lionel Foyster, and his wife Mary Ann from 1930 to 1935, the reported phenomena spiraled. Mysterious writing appeared on the walls begging, "Mary Ann, please help me get out." Bottles flew across rooms. Mary Ann claimed to be thrown from her bed. A 1938 seance supposedly made contact with a spirit called Marie Lair, described as a French nun murdered by a Waldegrave. The rectory burned on February 27, 1939, and the insurance company concluded the fire looked deliberately set. Price published The Most Haunted House in England in 1940, cataloging over 2,000 incidents. He created the first ever handbook for paranormal investigation and recruited 48 volunteers to help run the study. Modern ghost hunting as a practice traces its methodology back to that handbook. And then the whole thing collapsed. A 1956 report from the Society for Psychical Research concluded, when analyzed, the evidence for haunting and poltergeist activity for each and every period appears to diminish in force and finally to vanish away. Mary Ann Foyster admitted she'd faked the wall writings and the bell ringing, confessing that she'd been carrying on a sexual relationship with lodger Frank Perlis and using the paranormal chaos as a smokescreen. Daily Mail reporter Charles Sutton alleged he'd caught Price walking around with pockets stuffed full of stones right after a poltergeist pebble had struck someone. Louis Mayerling went further in his 2000 book We Faked the Ghosts of Borley Rectory, describing how he'd worn a black cape and wandered the grounds at the rector's request. Mayerling's own words, "I would love to say that there was a grain of truth in it all, but I felt that the book had to be written to reveal the farcical truth about the house." Nothing remains of the rectory today, just a private house on the site. Borley Church, 12th century and grade 1 listed, still stands and still draws what you might generously call psychic tourists. Price's claims carry no credibility among ghost historians anymore, but the man essentially invented the modern ghost hunt, and that's a legacy that outlived his fraud. Number 4. Pluckley, Kent. The village whose ghosts were invented by one man. Pluckley, Kent, population 1,069, sitting 50 miles from London. The Domesday Book recorded it as Pluckley in 1086, and at that point, it was actually larger and more valuable than Ashford, assessed at £15 against Ashford's 5. A mention in the 1989 Guinness Book of Records crowned it the most haunted village in Britain with 12 reported ghosts. That category no longer exists in the book. What happened next is, to me, the most interesting ghost debunking in English history. Academic research published in the journal Folklore in 2025 by Dr. Simon Morton of UWE Bristol traced every single haunted claim attached to Pluckley back to one man. Frederick William Sanders, born 1908, died 1996. Sanders first called Pluckley the most haunted village in England in an article for the Kentish Express in 1950, documented 10 ghost stories drawn from local sources, and published his memoir Pluckley Was My Playground 5 years later in 1955. Before Sanders, not a word. Reverend Ashton Oxenden's autobiography from 1891, covering his 20 years as Pluckley's vicar, mentions zero paranormal activity. Travel books from 1907, 1921, and 1924 contain nothing about hauntings. Pre-war guidebooks are completely silent on the subject. Dr. Morton summarized the finding this way: "What's exciting about this research is that it's been possible to demonstrate how one person with a passion for these kinds of story was able to shape, for better or worse, the identity of a whole village." Credit where it's due, Sanders had a talent for this. The ghosts he popularized tell great stories. The Red Lady, a daring family member searching the churchyard for her stillborn baby, reportedly buried in 7 lead coffins inside an oak coffin. The Screaming Man, a brickworks laborer smothered beneath a collapsing clay wall. A highwayman named Robert Dubois, killed when someone hurled a spear through the hollow tree where he was hiding. The Watercress Woman, who caught fire when a spark from her pipe ignited the whiskey she was drinking. A phantom coach and horses reportedly witnessed as recently as November 1997. Pluckley lacks street lighting, which certainly helps the atmosphere, and the place has appeared on Most Haunted and Ghost Hunters International. Ghost walks operate regularly, but the genuine story of Pluckley isn't whether any of those ghosts exist. It's how one man with a good pen and a few campfire tales rewrote the identity of an entire English village, and how that identity, once it took root, became self-perpetuating and impossible to undo. Number 3. Whitby, Yorkshire, where Dracula found his name. Whitby ranks as the largest town on this list at around 13,000 people, and you might think that disqualifies it, but here's what's actually happening to this place. Population dropped from 13,594 in 2001 to approximately 12,600 by 2021 because nearly 45% of residences have converted into holiday lets or second homes. If shrinking coastal communities and the economics of tourism swallowing a town interest you, Whitby deserves a long look. The reason it belongs on this list, though, is that Whitby may be the single most influential creepy town in English literature. Bram Stoker checked into Mrs. Veazey's guest house at 6 Royal Crescent at the end of July 1890, already developing a vampire story around a character called Count Wampire. On August 8, 1890, inside Whitby's public library, he cracked open William Wilkinson's account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia from 1820 and found a footnote that read, "Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil." That footnote gave the novel its name. August 8th also happens to be the exact date the fictional ghost ship Demeter runs aground in the finished book. That fictional shipwreck borrowed from a real one. A Russian schooner called the Dmitri, loaded with silver sand out of Antwerp, wrecked at Tate Hill Sands on October 24, 1885, and Stoker turned it into Dracula's vessel. He also walked through St. Mary's Churchyard, copying headstone names, including Swales, which became Dracula's first Whitby victim, and he collected 168 Yorkshire dialect words that ended up scattered throughout the published novel. Whitby's darkness runs far deeper than one Irish novelist's research trip, though. The abbey dates to 657 AD and hosted the Synod of Whitby in 664, a gathering that shaped English Christianity. Coffin rest benches still line the famous 199 steps, worn smooth by centuries of nocturnal burial processions. Graves have literally tumbled off the eroding cliff face, spilling bones at the base, and sitting inside Whitby Museum is the only surviving hand of glory on the planet, a mummified criminal's hand that, according to folklore, rendered entire households unconscious when burglars lit its fingers, an object that inspired the Hand of Glory in Harry Potter. Stoker channeled the town's atmosphere through Mina Murray's diary. Masses of sea fog came drifting inland, white, wet clouds which swept by in a ghostly fashion, so dank and damp and cold that it needed but little effort of imagination to think that the spirits of those lost at sea were touching their living brethren with the clammy hands of death. Between 1766 and 1816, Whitby's whaling fleet brought back 2,761 whales, 25,000 seals, 43 narwhals, 64 walruses, and 55 polar bears. Every crew member but one drowned in the lifeboat tragedy of 1861. The hospital ship Rohilla went down at Saltwick Bay on October 30th, 1914. Local ammonite fossils carry a legend that St. Hilda turned plague-bearing snakes to stone, and 3 of those so-called snake stones appear on the town's coat of arms. Modern Whitby leans into its dark reputation with both hands. Joe Hampshire founded the Whitby Goth Weekend in 1994 as a gathering of 40 pen pals, and it now pulls over 8,000 visitors twice a year, pumping approximately £1.1 million into the local economy. A 2022 gathering at the Abbey drew 1,369 people dressed as vampires, enough to break the Guinness World Record. Travel and Tour World has called the town the UK's capital of dark tourism. Number 2. Pendle, Lancashire, where a child sent 10 people to the gallows. We're in Lancashire now, in the cluster of tiny villages ringing Pendle Hill. New Church in Pendle at 265 people, Borley at 298, roughly, Fence. The hill itself rises 557 meters, a Pennine outlier, and its name is a triple tautology, Cumbric pen meaning hill, plus Saxon hill meaning hill, plus the English word hill. So you're literally saying hill, hill, hill every time you say the name. 2%. That's how much of every witch execution in England's entire 300-year witch hunting period took place in this one community, in a single year, 1612. Everything started on March 21st, 1612, when a young woman named Alison Device cursed a peddler named John Law, who promptly collapsed. Magistrate Roger Nowell examined the first suspects on March 30th, and what emerged were two feuding families of cunning women, the Demdike and Chattox clans, caught in a web of accusations that kept tightening. Old Chattox reportedly raided graves at Newchurch churchyard to collect skulls and teeth for spells, and the accused supposedly held a witch's sabbath at a place called Malkin Tower on Good Friday, April 10, 1612, where they plotted to blow up Lancaster Castle. And here is the detail that makes this story land differently than any other English witch trial. The key prosecution witness was 9 years old. Janet Device testified against her own mother, her brother, and her sister. Normal English law barred a child that young from giving evidence, but King James I's witchcraft statutes carved out an exception, and a 9-year-old girl sent her family to the gallows. 12 stood accused. 10 swung from the rope on August 20, 1612, at Gallows Hill in Lancaster. Old Demdike, roughly 80 years old, died in prison before she ever reached trial. Thomas Potts, the court clerk, published his account the following year, 1613, under the title The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. One name on the accused list stands apart. Alice Nutter, a gentlewoman from Ruffley Hall, maintained her innocence from start to finish and never offered a defense. Historian Stephen Pumphrey has argued that Nutter was spotted at Malkin Tower while traveling to a secret Catholic meeting, not a witch's sabbath, and that she kept silent at trial to protect fellow Catholics. Lancashire served as a stronghold of Catholic recusancy at the time, which means there's a credible reading of these trials as anti-Catholic persecution wrapped in witchcraft language. Pendle remains desolate and atmospheric. A 17th century cottage with cat bones bricked into its walls, a traditional ward against witchcraft, turned up in the hill's shadow in 2011. Locals historically refused to climb the hill after dark. Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman named two characters in Good Omens after the accused, Agnes Nutter and Anathema Device. The Bishop of Burnley, Right Reverend John Goddard, publicly objected to 400th anniversary celebrations in 2012, calling them a light-hearted treatment of injustice and oppression. For that same anniversary, 482 people dressed as witches walked up Pendle Hill in a world record attempt. Lancaster Castle, where the trials played out, runs tours. A statue of Alice Nutter stands in Ruffley, unveiled in 2012, 400 years after she was hanged for a crime she almost certainly did not commit. Number 1. Eyam, Derbyshire, the village that chose to die. Eyam, pronounced Eam, sits in the Derbyshire Dales within the Peak District National Park, about 10 miles west of Sheffield, home to 969 people. Stone cottages line the lanes. An 8th century Anglo-Saxon cross stands at St. Lawrence's Church, and lead mining heritage stretches back to Roman times. A beautiful, quiet place. In 1665, a bundle of flea-infested cloth arrived from London, intended for a local tailor. George Vickers, his assistant, opened the bundle, and he was buried on September 7, 1665, as the first victim of bubonic plague. What happened next defies belief. Rector William Mompesson and former rector Thomas Stanley persuaded the entire village to seal itself off from the outside world, knowing full well that many of them would die inside the boundary they drew around their own homes. They did this to stop the plague from reaching surrounding towns. A Royal Society academic study, working from parish records, counted 257 deaths among 689 people at risk across 210 households. 37% of the village died, a mortality rate that exceeded London's during the same plague. The outbreak burned for 14 months, from September 1665 through November 1, 1666. August of 1666 alone killed 78 people, 5 to 6 per day in a community this small. The formal quarantine boundary went into effect on June 24, 1666. The individual stories inside that quarantine are almost unbearable. Elizabeth Hancock lost her husband and 6 children across 8 days in August 1666, and she dragged each body up a hillside alone to dig their graves because her neighbors stood watching from a distance, too frightened to come closer. All 9 members of the Thorpe family were wiped out. 7 of 8 Siddalls died, leaving 3-year-old Joseph Siddall as the sole survivor. Jane Hawksworth lost 25 family members. Rector Mompesson's wife, Catherine, had spent weeks tending the sick. On August 22, 1666, she told her husband she could smell the sweet smell of the meadow, which was actually her organs beginning to shut down. She died the following day. A stonemason carved her name incorrectly on her tomb, and that mistake is still visible today. Then there were separated lovers, Emmett Seidel and Roland Torre, who met every day at a stream running along opposite sides of the quarantine boundary, close enough to speak but unable to touch. One day, Emmett stopped appearing at the water. She had died. The Earl of Devonshire at Chatsworth kept the quarantine viable by supplying food in exchange for the villagers staying within their boundary. Church services moved outdoors to Cucklet Delph, a 17th century version of social distancing that predated COVID lockdowns by 3.5 centuries. Abraham Morton died on November 1st, 1666, recorded as the final victim. Genetic research in 2000 turned up something unexpected in Eyam's descendants. Survivors carried the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, which grants resistance to both plague and HIV/AIDS. A separate 2016 study found that 75% of plague transmission in Eyam moved human to human, not through rats. Eyam Museum operates today in the Old Methodist Chapel. Plague Sunday, an annual memorial service at Cucklet Delph, has been observed since 1866. COVID sent worldwide interest in the village surging. Poet Simon Armitage drew a direct line between Eyam and lockdown in his 2020 poem Lockdown, and the village-inspired Geraldine Brooks novel Year of Wonders, along with Don Taylor's play The Roses of Eyam. Dr. Liam Whittles of Imperial College captured why Eyam still matters to epidemiology. Eyam is important because it gives us fantastic data for the plague. We know about individuals, about households, and particularly when people died. But the data isn't what puts Eyam at number 1. The choice does. Ordinary people, miners and farmers and tradespeople, were told that the best thing they could do for the world outside their village was to stay inside it and probably die. And they stayed, voluntarily. That is not creepy in the way a ghost story is creepy. That is creepy because it happened, because every death is documented, and because it forces a question none of us want to sit with. Would you have stayed? The scariest thing about every town on this list is not the paranormal, it's the documented truth. If you found this worth your time, the subscribe button is right there, and like the video because I want to see you on the next one.